Imagine this, the 1980s, a time when everything seemed designed to stand out. Sports cars, more aggressive, faster, louder, and yet, in the middle of all that, there was another kind of car, longer, more practical, built for families, cars that, in theory, weren't meant to stand out. But some of them had something different. Proportions you simply don't see anymore, lines that blended elegance with presence, and details that, over time, became almost impossible to find. They have a personality that many modern cars simply can't replicate. And here's the most interesting part. No one talked about them. No one looked at them as something special. But today, when you see them with different eyes, you realize something very clear. Some of the most beautiful wagons of the 1980s never tried to be, and still, they were. 1987 to 1989, Buick Electra Estate Wagon. Imagine this, late 1980s, a family getting ready for a long trip, luggage going into the back, kids settling into the third row, and up front, a car that didn't seem in a hurry to get anywhere, long, imposing, almost as if it floated even when standing still. The Electra didn't need to ask for attention, because it already had it. From the first glance, there was something different. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't sporty, but it had a very particular kind of elegance. The kind that doesn't rely on excess, but on well-balanced proportions. A wide, solid front end, long, clean side panels, and that classic wood paneling, which in the 1980s wasn't a retro detail. It was a symbol of family status. Because, yes, as strange as it might seem today, having wood paneling on a wagon back then was almost a way of saying you had reached a certain level. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because the Electra wasn't just big, it was a luxury wagon, spacious interiors, soft seats, a sense of comfort designed for covering hundreds of miles without effort. And there's one detail that perfectly defines this kind of car. In the 1980s, many American families would cross entire states by road, and cars like this weren't just an option. They were part of the experience, and under the hood, everything followed that same logic. V8 engines like the 307, with around 140 horsepower, weren't built to be fast. They were built to last. But here's the contrast. Because even though it was a family car, even though it was built for everyday life, it had a presence that many modern cars simply don't achieve. It didn't need to be flashy, or innovative, or extreme. It just needed to be solid, and that was more than enough. Today, when you look at its current value, you notice something interesting. They're not unreachable cars, but they're not ignored either. A well-preserved Buick Electra Estate can range between $8,000 and $18,000, depending on condition and originality, and some very well-kept examples. Even go beyond that, not because they're rare, but because of what they represent. Because this car isn't just another wagon, it's a time capsule. From a time when traveling wasn't just about arriving, it was part of the memory. And that is something that today is hard to find. 1985, Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser. Imagine an ordinary morning in the 1980s. A quiet street, houses lined up, and parked in front of one of them. A car that didn't go unnoticed. Not because it was flashy, but because of its size. The Custom Cruiser didn't try to be elegant like the Buick, nor modern, nor sporty. Its approach was different. It was massive, wide, long, with a presence that made everything around it feel smaller. And that wasn't by accident. Back then, size was still a form of status. It wasn't just about space. It was about what it communicated. The bigger it was, the more important it seemed. And the Custom Cruiser spoke that language perfectly. Its design reflected that without complications. Straight lines, massive proportions. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't a car trying to be overly refined. It was a car built around a sense of solidity. A spacious interior, comfortable seats, smooth driving, everything designed for long distances. And that makes perfect sense when you understand the context. In the 1980s, before SUVs took over the market, these wagons were the ultimate family vehicle. Long trips, vacations, endless highways. Cars like this were practically an extension of the home. And under the hood, everything followed that same logic. V8 engines like the 307, with numbers similar to the Buick, weren't meant to impress on paper, but to deliver a steady, effortless drive. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. And here's the contrast. Because despite being a purely family-oriented car, it had an almost dominant presence. Not elegant, not modern, but it commanded respect. It was the kind of car that didn't try to be liked. It simply took up its space. And in the 1980s, that was enough. When you look at its current value, that becomes clear. A well-preserved Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser typically ranges between $7,000 and $15,000, with better examples reaching higher figures. It's not an exclusive car, but it's far from irrelevant, because what you're looking at here isn't just a wagon. It's the end of an era where size was everything. 1987 Chevrolet Caprice Estate Wagon. This car was impossible to ignore, not because of flashy details, but because of how it occupied space. Long, low, with proportions that felt made for the open road. The Caprice Estate had something very particular. It was the perfect balance between family practicality and iconic presence. Its design was clean, smoother than many others of the time, with flowing lines and that classic wood paneling that defined the great American wagons. It wasn't aggressive, but it had presence. The kind that doesn't need effort, and this is exactly where it fits perfectly in its time. In the 1980s, Chevrolet knew exactly what it was doing, because this car wasn't just another option. It was one of the most recognizable vehicles in the entire United States. It was in neighborhoods, on family road trips, in movies, practically everywhere. Under the hood, options like the 305 V8 with around 170 horsepower delivered a smooth driving experience, enough to move all that size without effort. It wasn't fast, but it felt solid, stable, built to last, and that's what defined it. It didn't aim to stand out through numbers, but through how it felt in everyday life. Comfortable, predictable, reliable. But there's an interesting detail. This type of wagon was starting to share space with something new. While the Caprice still dominated the roads, the first minivans were already beginning to reshape the market, offering the same purpose, in a different format. And that's the contrast, because the Caprice didn't need to reinvent itself. It was still the benchmark, but at the same time, it was living its final years at the top. Today, that gives it a different kind of value. A well-preserved Caprice Estate typically ranges between $9,000 and $20,000, depending on condition. It's not rare, but it's becoming increasingly appreciated, because more than just a wagon, this car represents what, for years, was the standard of the American family. And now I'm curious, out of the ones we've seen so far, which one impresses you the most? Do you go with the luxury of the Electra, the presence of the Custom Cruiser, or does this Caprice feel like the most complete? Let me know in the comments. 1986 Ford LTD Country Squire. This car didn't try to reinvent anything, and that's exactly why it works so well. In many ways, it was the definition of an American wagon in the 1980s. Big, comfortable, and with a visual identity that left no room for doubt. One glance was enough to recognize it. Wood paneling running along the sides, straight lines, that long, stable presence, built for effortless travel. It wasn't modern, but it didn't need to be, because Ford had spent decades refining this formula, and at this point, it had completely mastered it. The interior followed that same idea. Plenty of space, wide, comfortable seats, a smooth driving experience that felt designed for long highways rather than city streets. This wasn't a car meant to move fast. It was meant to move well. And that makes perfect sense when you understand its context. Before SUVs took over the market, this kind of wagon was the logical choice for large families. Practical, comfortable, and with a presence that conveyed safety. Under the hood, V8 engines like the 302, with around 150 horsepower, delivered exactly what was needed. It didn't stand out for power, but for consistency. Smooth acceleration, no surprises. Exactly what you expected from a car like this. But here's where the interesting contrast appears, because even though it was a fully functional car, it had a very strong identity. It wasn't just another wagon. It was the classic American wagon. And today, that feels even more evident, because this kind of design has practically disappeared. When you look at its current value, that begins to show. A well-preserved Ford LTD Country Squire typically ranges between $8,000 and $18,000, with better-kept examples going even higher. 1988 Mercury Colony Park. This car didn't try to stand out through size, even though it had it. Its approach was different, a step further into refinement within the world of large American wagons. The Colony Park shared its foundation with the Country Squire, but from the first glance, it felt different. Cleaner, more elegant, with a presence that was less rugged and more refined. The chrome details were better integrated, the lines felt smoother, and the overall design carried a more premium feel. It still had the classic wood paneling, but here, it didn't feel like just a traditional touch. It felt intentional, more balanced, more thought out. And that defines Mercury perfectly at that time. It wasn't an extreme brand. It didn't try to break boundaries, but it offered something more refined than usual, without drifting too far from reality. The interior followed the same logic, spacious, comfortable, but with a more careful attention to materials and finishes. It wasn't full luxury, but it was clearly a step above basic, and that was reflected in the driving experience. V8 engines like the 302, with around 150 horsepower, delivered a smooth, progressive response, without effort. It wasn't meant to be fast, but to feel good at all times. It was the kind of car that didn't tire you out, that made long trips feel easier, almost natural. And here's the contrast. Because even though it shared its foundation with more common models, this one felt different. Not because of what it did, but because of how it did it. Quieter, more balanced, more refined, and in a segment where everything tended to be big and functional. That made all the difference. There's an interesting detail that helps explain it even better. In the 1980s, many American brands were starting to clearly separate their lineups, and Mercury occupied that perfect middle ground, more than Ford, but not quite Lincoln. The Colony Park is exactly that, and today, that gives it a very particular kind of value. A well-preserved Mercury Colony Park typically ranges between $9,000 and $19,000, with well-kept examples going even higher. 1986 Chrysler Town Country. This car didn't feel like just another wagon, and that was exactly the point, because Chrysler wasn't just trying to compete on space or practicality, it was trying to elevate the concept. The Town & Country name had always been tied to something more refined. And in the 1980s, that still mattered. At first glance, it already felt different, more elegant, more intentional, with details designed to separate it from the rest. The wood paneling was still there, but here it felt more refined, better integrated, more deliberate. The front end had more character, and the overall design leaned closer to luxury than utility. It wasn't the biggest, it wasn't the most imposing, but it was one of the most purposeful. And that became even clearer inside. More comfortable interiors, better materials, a feeling that this car was designed for more than just moving people around. Under the hood, options like the 5.2-liter V8 with around 150 horsepower followed the classic formula. It wasn't fast, but it delivered a smooth, steady drive, perfect for long distances. But here's the interesting contrast, because even though it was still a traditional wagon, it already felt like something that was evolving. It didn't break from the past, but it wasn't fully tied to it either. And today, that gives it a very specific kind of value. A well-preserved Chrysler Town Country wagon typically ranges between $8,000 and $17,000, with very clean examples going higher. And now I want to hear from you. Out of everything we've seen so far, which one is surprising you the most? Do you prefer the more classic approach from Ford and Chevrolet? Or does this more refined Chrysler feel more interesting to you? Let me know in the comments. 1986 Ford Taurus. This car didn't seem to belong on this list. And yet, it's one of the most important ones here, because while all these wagons followed a very clear formula, big, long, straight lines, the Taurus arrived and broke all of that completely. Shorter, rounder, more modern. The design felt like it came from another decade, Smooth surfaces, more developed aerodynamics, a silhouette that left behind everything that defined classic American wagons. Under the hood, V6 engines like the 3.0-liter with around 140 horsepower offered a completely different kind of experience, lighter, more agile, closer to a modern car than a traditional wagon. It didn't have the soft, floating character of the big V8S, but in return, it felt easier, more direct, more logical. And here's the contrast. Because even without the imposing presence of the others, without the size, without the classic styling, it was, in many ways, the most advanced car of them all. And cars like this set the direction for everything that came after. When you look at its value today, that becomes clear too. A well-preserved Ford Taurus wagon typically ranges between $5,000 and $12,000, lower than others on this list, but with enormous historical significance. Because this car doesn't represent the peak of classic wagons. It represents the beginning of their transformation. 1982, AMC Eagle wagon. This car shouldn't be here. And that's exactly what makes it so interesting. Because while every other wagon on this list followed a very clear formula, rear-wheel drive, large size, pure family focus, the AMC Eagle did something completely different. All-wheel drive, yes. In 1982, long before SUVs dominated the market, long before all-wheel drive became something common, this car was already solving a problem almost no one else was even thinking about. And that completely changes how you see it. At first glance, it looks like just another wagon. Classic proportions, simple lines, even that slightly understated, almost forgettable presence. But when you look closer, you start to notice something different. Under the hood, engines like the 4.2-liter inline-six with around 110 horsepower weren't built to impress, but to deliver something far more important: reliability and control. There's an interesting detail that says everything. Many people consider the AMC Eagle to be one of the true early predecessors of modern SUVs. And when you see it that way, everything makes sense. Because this car wasn't trying to compete with wagons. It was creating something new. And that makes it even more special today. A well-preserved AMC Eagle wagon can range between $10,000 and $20,000, with clean examples going even higher, precisely because of that rarity and that ahead-of-its-time concept. It's not the most elegant, it's not the most popular, but it might be the most important. And when you look at all these cars together, you start to realize something interesting. None of them followed exactly the same idea. Some focused on size, others on luxury, others on comfort, and some even on the future. Now, I want to hear from you. Out of all the ones we've seen today, which one do you think is truly the most beautiful wagon of the 1980s? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of car, you need to watch this next video about the most iconic wagons of the 1980s. Because there, you'll find models that weren't just beautiful. They were so different. They almost feel like they came from another world. And when you see them, you'll understand why they're still remembered today.